The rumble of 6 motorcycles echoed through the quiet streets of Millfield like thunder before a storm, growing louder with each passing second until the sound seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the small Indiana town. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of sleepy hour when most honest people were at work or school, when the streets belonged to delivery trucks and the occasional soccer mom, running errands between piano lessons and grocery shopping. Frank Novak didn't look up from the 1987 Chevy Impala engine he was rebuilding when the sound grew louder, closer, more threatening with each revolution of those 6 powerful engines. His weathered hands, scarred by decades of honest work and other, less discussable activities, continued their methodical work on cylinder number 3, checking compression with the same deliberate precision he'd applied to everything for the past 23 years. A kind of precision that had once saved lives in places that didn't appear on any map. He simply set down his wrench with the care of a man who'd learned that hasty movements often led to broken things or broken people, and wiped his hands on a rag that had absorbed more motor oil than a Texas refinery. The rag itself told a story to anyone who cared to read it. Faded blue denim, soft from countless washings, with stains that mapped out decades of honest work. Frank had owned it longer than most people owned cars, and it had been with him through transmission rebuilds, engine overhauls, and more mundane tasks like cleaning the coffee pot that sat permanently warming on the corner of his workbench. Outside, the rumble resolved into distinct engines 6 Harley-Davidson motorcycles, their exhausts modified to produce maximum noise and intimidation. Frank knew engines the way some men knew women or others knew whiskey, and he could tell from the sound alone that these bikes were well maintained, expensive, and ridden by people who understood machinery. That made them more dangerous than weekend warriors or wannabe tough guys. Real bikers who knew their equipment were usually serious about other aspects of their business as well. The motorcycles circled his shop once, twice, like wolves testing the perimeter of a camp, their riders scanning for witnesses, escape routes, and potential complications. Frank watched through his shop window as they finally settled into a neat formation in the gravel parking lot, 6 men dismounting with the practiced coordination of a military unit. Their movements were synchronized in a way that spoke to shared experience and possibly shared time behind bars. The interior reflected Frank's personality, organized, chaos that made perfect sense to him, and utter confusion to anyone else. Tools hung from pegboards, in arrangements that seemed random but allowed Frank to find any implement within seconds. Parts bins lined the walls, filled with everything from spark plugs to transmission gears, sorted by some system that existed only in Frank's mind, but worked with mechanical precision. Oil stains on the concrete floor mapped out decades of automotive surgery. Each discoloration marking, where some mechanical problem had been diagnosed and cured. The workbench itself was a monument to function over form, built from heavy oak planks and steel brackets that could support an engine block without flexing. Its surface bore the scars of countless projects burns from welding torches, cuts from metal edges, and the accumulated patina of motor oil, coffee spills, and honest sweat. Frank had built the bench himself during his first week of ownership, designing it to last forever and handle whatever automotive challenges might arise. A calendar from Millfield First National Bank hung on the wall, still showing August, despite being 3 weeks into September. Next to it, a faded American flag, the kind that had actually flown somewhere important rather than being manufactured for decoration. The flag had 48 stars, a relic from Frank's father's generation, when America was smaller, but perhaps more certain of its purpose. Below the flag, almost hidden among the clutter of invoices and work orders, sat a photograph in a simple black frame. The image showed 8 men in desert camouflage, their faces young and hard beneath helmet straps and protective eyewear. They stood beside a modified Humvee that bore scars from encounters with improvised explosive devices and small arms fire. Sand and heat shimmers blurred the background, but the men themselves stood with the sharp clarity of soldiers who'd learned to focus on the immediate and deadly. In the center of the group, barely recognizable beneath 30 years of civilian life and peaceful routine, stood someone who might have been Frank Novak if Frank Novak had ever been young, hard and dangerous enough to earn a place in America's most elite fighting unit. The photograph bore a faded inscription at the bottom: Delta Force, Operation Desert, Storm Team Charlie, 1991. But the photograph was just another piece of shop decoration to most visitors, no more significant than the oil company calendars or the hand-lettered sign that read, "Payment due upon completion." Most people saw an old picture of soldiers and moved on, their attention caught by more immediate concerns, like repair estimates and completion dates. They had no way of knowing they were looking at one of the most classified military units in American history, or that the man in the center had personally accounted for more enemy casualties than most infantry companies. The shop bell chimed as the first man pushed through the door, the sound sharp and discordant in the sudden silence that had fallen over Millfield's main street. He was tall, bearded, with arms like tree trunks and shoulders that had been built through years of hard labor and harder living. His vest bore the scars of a life lived on the edge knife, cuts repaired with rough stitching, burn marks from motorcycle exhaust, and stains that might have been motor oil or might have been something else entirely. Behind him came the others, filing through the door in order of rank and seniority, filling the small space with the smell of leather, engine oil, road dust, and something that made the air feel heavier and more dangerous. They moved with the confidence of men who'd never met serious opposition, who'd learned that size and numbers and willingness to use violence could solve most problems that arose in their line of work. The leader stepped forward first, his boots heavy on the oil-stained concrete floor. Tank Morrison had gotten his nickname, the old-fashioned way by, being roughly the size and weight of a small armored vehicle, and approximately twice as destructive when properly motivated. He stood 6'4" in his socks and weighed 260 pounds of muscle, fat, and scar tissue accumulated over 43 years of rough living and rougher company. Tank's criminal record read like a guided tour of the American penal system: assault in California, armed robbery in Nevada, aggravated battery in Colorado, and a weapons charge in Missouri that had earned him 18 months in federal prison. He'd done time in 7 facilities across 4 states, had been stabbed twice and shot once, and had never met a problem he couldn't solve with his fists, a tire iron, or sheer intimidation backed by credible threats of violence. More importantly for the current situation, he'd never lost a fight. Not in prison, not in bars, not in parking lots or back alleys or any of the other places where disputes got settled with violence rather than words or legal proceedings. His reputation was built on the simple principle that Tank Morrison hit harder and lasted longer than anyone foolish enough to test him. And that reputation had served him well in his current profession of extracting money from people who'd rather keep it. Frank straightened slowly, his 70-year-old frame unfolding with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that sudden movements were often the last movements a person made. He'd been working on engines since before most of these men were born, and his body showed the accumulated wear of decades spent bent over machinery, crawling under vehicles, and lifting components that should have required 2 men to move. His face was weathered, but calm, creased by sun and worry lines, but unmarked by fear. Gray hair kept short out of old habit, framed blue eyes that had seen too much of the world to be impressed by leather, vests and aggressive posturing. When he turned to face his visitors, those eyes held something that a careful observer might have recognized. Not the resignation of an old man facing inevitable defeat, but the patient assessment of a professional evaluating a tactical situation. Frank had learned long ago to read men quickly and accurately, to distinguish between genuine threats and elaborate bluffs, to assess capabilities and intentions in the first few seconds of contact. "Help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice carrying the same tone he might use to discuss carburetor problems or transmission fluid changes. No challenge, no submission. Just the neutral courtesy of a businessman greeting potential customers. "Frank Novak?" Tank's voice rumbled like distant artillery, the kind of sound that made small animals seek shelter. Can smart people find somewhere else to be? That's what the sign says. Frank nodded toward the front window, where Novak's Auto Repair was painted in faded letters that he touched up every spring when the weather turned. Warm enough for outdoor work. Tank smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that warmed rooms or made children feel safe. It was the smile of a shark that had just detected blood in the water, the expression of a predator who'd found prey that didn't yet understand the nature of the food chain. "Heard you fix cars when they're broken." Frank's response was simple, factual, delivered without emphasis or emotion. He might have been discussing the weather, or the price of gasoline, or any other mundane topic that required no particular investment of energy or attention. "Well, that's good, real good, because we're here about something that might get broken if it ain't properly maintained." Tank let the word hang in the air like smoke from a poorly tuned engine, heavy with implications and unspoken threats. As Tank spoke, the other 5 men spread out through the shop with the casual purposefulness of soldiers securing a perimeter. They moved without verbal commands, their actions coordinated through experience and unspoken understanding. Each man took position near something valuable or fragile, their message clear without being explicit. The youngest of the group, a wiry man in his 20s with prison tattoos covering his neck like a roadmap of bad decisions, picked up a ball peen hammer from Frank's tool rack and tested its weight with the casual interest of someone shopping for produce. His name was Eddie Kowalski, though most people called him Snake, for reasons that became apparent once you saw him move. He'd done 2 stretches in state prison for aggravated assault and had earned his stripes with the Iron Wolves by putting a rival gang member in intensive care with nothing but a tire iron and 30 seconds of uncontrolled violence. Snake had never met an old man he couldn't intimidate, or a young man he couldn't beat senseless, and he approached his work with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed causing pain. "Heavy," Snake said to no one in particular, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone who'd learned early that showing emotion was often interpreted as weakness, could do some damage to delicate equipment. Another member of the group, a heavy-set man with graying hair and arms covered in military tattoos, Army Rangers, according to the ink, though Frank immediately recognized them as stolen valor, rather than earned honors, had positioned himself near Frank's computer terminal, where customer records and parts orders were stored. His name was Carl Brennan, and his specialty was making problems disappear, whether those problems were witnesses, evidence, or computerized records that might cause inconvenience for his employers. "Nice computer," Carl observed, running one thick finger along the monitor's edge with proprietary interest. Lot of important information on these things. Customer records, financial data, tax records. Real shame when they crash. Hard drives fail all the time, usually when you need them most. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. The iron wolves had learned through experience that physical violence, while effective, attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies that were already stretched thin, but still capable of causing problems when properly motivated. But privacy violations, identity theft, and personal harassment were harder to trace and prosecute, especially when the victims were too frightened to file formal complaints or cooperate with investigations. Frank watched them with the same attention he might give to an engine diagnostic, systematic and thorough, and completely professional. He noted their positions, their body language, the way they moved and communicated without words. These weren't random thugs or weekend warriors playing at being dangerous. They were professionals, organized and experienced, and very good at what they did for a living. What they did was prey on decent people who'd worked hard for what little they had, who couldn't afford to fight back and couldn't expect protection from law enforcement that was spread too thin, across too much territory. The Iron Wolves had built their operation on the simple principle that most people would pay almost anything to avoid trouble, and that those who wouldn't pay could be made to reconsider their position through the application of appropriate pressure. Frank's expression didn't change as he absorbed this information. He'd heard threats before, though admittedly not recently. Not for about 23 years, to be precise. Not since he'd walked away from a life where threats were as common as morning coffee and considerably more dangerous to ignore. And what would that be? Frank asked, his voice remaining steady and unremarkable. Your shop, old man. Your business. Your peace of mind. Tank gestured around the cluttered garage with one massive hand, taking in the ancient equipment, the faded calendars, the workbench that had seen more action than most soldiers, the careful organization that spoke to decades of methodical work and professional pride. See, we provide a service in this town: protection, insurance, peace of mind. And right now, you're unprotected. The word unprotected carried weight in Tank's mouth, the kind of weight that came from years of making similar speeches to similar targets. The Iron Wolves had refined their approach through practice, learning exactly how much pressure to apply and when to apply it. Too little, and people thought they were bluffing. Too much, and they attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies that preferred to maintain the illusion of safety in small towns. Seems peaceful enough to me, Frank observed, his tone mild as morning coffee. He glanced around his shop, taking in the familiar disorder of tools and parts, and projects in various stages of completion. Everything looked exactly as it had when he'd arrived that morning, exactly as it had every morning for the past 23 years. Tank's smile widened, showing teeth that had been broken and repaired more than once. That's the thing about peace, Pops. It's fragile, delicate. Things can disturb it. Accidents can happen. Equipment can malfunction. Buildings can develop problems. What kind of protection are we talking about? Frank asked, his voice carrying nothing more than professional curiosity. He might have been asking about warranty, coverage, or service intervals, or any other aspect of routine business operations. $500 a month, Tank replied without hesitation. The number had been carefully calculated, high enough to generate serious revenue, but low enough to seem reasonable compared to the alternative. Very reasonable, very fair, especially considering the costs of reconstruction. And what would those costs be? Tank's expression grew more serious, the smile fading into something colder and more businesslike. Let's just say that accidents happen, Pops. Equipment fails. Sometimes buildings burn down. Very tragic. Very expensive to replace. Insurance companies ask a lot of questions when claims get filed. Investigations can be time-consuming, disruptive to business, bad for customer confidence. The implication was clear enough. Pay the money, or lose everything in ways that wouldn't be covered by any insurance policy and couldn't be proven in any court of law. The Iron Wolves had done their homework, as they always did. They knew that Frank's shop was his only source of income, that he lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, that he had no family to speak of, and few close friends who might ask uncomfortable questions if something happened to him. What they didn't know was considerably more important than what they did. A fourth member of the group, a man with a mohawk and arms, covered in military tattoos that Frank immediately recognized as fake, had positioned himself near the shop's electrical panel. His name was Rick Torres, though most people called him Sparky, for his ability to cause power failures and electrical fires that left no traceable evidence of arson. Sparky had learned his trade during a 5-year stretch in state prison, where he'd specialized in making problems disappear for inmates who could afford his services. Electrical systems are tricky, Sparky observed, running his fingers along the circuit breaker panel with the familiarity of someone who understood how to cause maximum disruption with minimal effort. Old buildings like this, wiring gets brittle. Insulation breaks down. Fires start for no apparent reason. Very dangerous. Very expensive to repair. Snake had moved closer to Frank's workbench, where the framed photographs sat propped against a coffee can full of bolts and washers. He glanced at it with the casual disinterest of someone who'd never served and didn't understand what he was seeing. To him, it was just another piece of old man memorabilia, no more significant than the calendar, or the faded flag, or the collection of coffee cups that had accumulated over the years. But if Snake had looked more carefully, if he'd possessed the education and experience to understand what he was seeing, he might have noticed certain details. The weapons the soldiers carried, for instance, not standard army issue, but specialized equipment used by units that officially didn't exist. The vehicles in the background, modified far beyond normal military specifications. The way the men stood, alert and professional, and ready for violence at a moment's notice. Most tellingly, he might have noticed the patch, visible on one soldier's sleeve, a subdued design that featured an eagle, a trident, and a sword crossed over a shield. It was the patch of Delta Force, the Army's most elite special operations unit, the kind of organization that recruited only the best and deployed only when conventional forces weren't sufficient for the mission requirements. But Snake saw none of this. Like most people, he saw what he expected to see, an old photograph of old soldiers from an old war, irrelevant to current circumstances and modern problems. 500 seemed steep, Frank said, his tone remaining conversational despite the mounting tension in the room. Business isn't what it used to be. People are holding on to their cars longer, doing more maintenance themselves. Economy's been tough on everyone. Tank's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering on a summer afternoon. He'd heard similar objections before, and he'd learned that allowing them to continue only encouraged further resistance. The key to successful intimidation was to establish dominance early and maintain it through consistent application of pressure. "It ain't a negotiation, old man," Tank said, his voice dropping to a register that made the windows rattle slightly. "It's a fact. Like gravity, like death, like what happens to people who don't pay attention to facts." Tank stepped closer, close enough that Frank could smell the beer on his breath and see the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw like a roadmap of old violence. Tank had gotten that scar in a knife fight in Chino State Prison, a disagreement over cigarettes that had escalated into something considerably more serious. The other guy hadn't been so lucky. He'd spent 3 weeks in the infirmary and learned to avoid Tank's section of the yard for the remainder of his sentence. The proximity was intentional, designed to make Frank feel small and vulnerable, and very aware of the size difference between them. Tank had used the technique hundreds of times before, and it had never failed to produce the desired effect. Most people, when confronted with 260 pounds of muscle and malevolence, decided that cooperation was preferable to confrontation. "Maybe you need a demonstration," Tank continued, his voice soft with implied violence. "Something to help you understand the situation better. Sometimes people need to see consequences before they appreciate the value of prevention." He nodded to Snake, who immediately brought the ball-peen hammer down on Frank's radio with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he genuinely enjoyed destroying other people's property. The sound of shattering plastic and sparking electronics filled the shop, followed by the sudden absence of the country music that had been playing softly in the background. The radio had been Frank's companion for 15 years, playing everything from morning talk shows to late-night music while he worked on the endless succession of vehicles that kept Millfield mobile. It wasn't expensive or particularly sophisticated, just a simple AM/FM unit that had served its purpose faithfully until Snake's hammer turned it into spare parts and scattered memories. "Oops," Tank said, his voice carrying mock concern. "Accident. See how easy it is for things to get broken?" And that was just a cheap radio. Imagine if something happened to more expensive equipment. Frank looked at the remains of his radio, then back at Tank. His expression remained calm, but something flickered in his pale blue eyes, not fear, not anger, but something else entirely. Something that a more experienced observer might have recognized as the kind of assessment a professional makes when evaluating a threat and calculating response options. "That radio is older than you are," Frank said quietly. "Well, now it's older than it'll ever get. Kind of like you, if you don't start paying attention." Tank leaned closer, invading Frank's personal space with the confidence of a man who'd never met anyone capable of making him back down. 500 monthly, starting now. Or we start breaking things that are harder to replace. Carl Brennan had moved to Frank's filing cabinet, a dented metal monstrosity that held decades of customer records, tax documents, and business paperwork. He pulled out a random folder and examined its contents with exaggerated interest, making sure Frank could see what he was doing. "Lot of paperwork here," Carl observed, his voice carrying the flat menace of someone discussing the weather while planning murder. Customer addresses, phone numbers, personal information. Amazing how much trouble can come from misplaced paperwork. People's privacy gets violated. Their personal business becomes public knowledge. Very embarrassing. Sometimes dangerous. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. The Iron Wolves had learned that physical violence, while effective, attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement. But privacy violations, identity theft, and personal harassment were harder to trace and prosecute, especially when the victims were too frightened to file formal complaints. Snake had selected a screwdriver from Frank's tool rack and was testing its point against his palm with the casual interest of someone examining a new toy. "Nice tools," he said, his voice carrying the kind of appreciation that suggested he was thinking of alternative uses for precision. "Instruments. German-made, expensive, sharp enough to be dangerous in the wrong hands." The final 2 members of the group had positioned themselves near the shop's 2 exits, blocking any possibility of escape without actually appearing to do so. They stood casually, hands in their pockets. But their placement was strategic and intentional. The message was clear. This conversation would continue until Tank decided it was over. Frank absorbed all of this information with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to evaluate tactical situations under pressure. He noted their positions, their weapons, visible and concealed, their body language, their level of training and coordination. They were professionals, no doubt about that, but they were professionals who'd grown comfortable with success, who'd forgotten that predators sometimes encountered prey that was more dangerous than it appeared. "I see," Frank said, folding his rag carefully and setting it on his workbench next to the photograph. "Can I ask you boys something?" "Shoot," Tank replied, the word carrying unintended irony. "Any of you ever serve?" The question seemed to catch them off guard, breaking the rhythm of threat and response that had been building since they'd entered the shop. Tank frowned, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to irritation, as he tried to determine the relevance of military service to their current business transaction. "What's that got to do with anything?" Tank demanded. "Just curious. You know, about respect, honor, protecting people instead of preying on them." Frank's voice remained mild, conversational, but his words carried weight that was impossible to ignore. Sparky snorted with derision, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Listen to this guy? What are you, some kind of Boy Scout? You think this is about honor? This is business, Pops. Pure and simple." "Something like that," Frank said quietly, his eyes drifting once again to the photograph on his workbench. Tank stepped forward again, closing the distance between them to less than arm's length, his massive presence designed to overwhelm and intimidate. "Let me tell you something, old man. The only thing I respect is strength. And right now, you got 6 of us and 1 of you. The math ain't complicated." "No," Frank agreed, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd done the math long before. Tank had finished speaking. "It isn't." That's when Tank made his first mistake and his last conscious decision for the next several hours. He reached out to grab Frank by the shirt, intending to demonstrate just how complicated the math could get for a 70-year-old man who didn't understand basic arithmetic or the fundamental principles of might makes right. He never completed the motion. What happened next took exactly 4 seconds and 7/10, though later police reports would struggle to piece together the precise sequence of events. The security camera mounted in the corner of the shop captured everything in grainy black and white, but the speed and efficiency of the encounter made it difficult to follow even in slow-motion replay. Tank's hand was halfway to Frank's collar when the old man moved. Not quickly, speed had never been Frank's primary asset, even during his younger and more dangerous years, but efficiently, purposefully, with the kind of precise economy of motion that comes from training that never really fades, no matter how many years of peaceful civilian life might intervene. Frank's left hand intercepted Tank's wrist with surgical precision, his fingers finding the pressure point that controlled the radial nerve, with the automatic accuracy of someone who'd performed the maneuver hundreds of times under considerably more stressful circumstances. His right hand, still holding the wrench he'd set down moments earlier, came up in a short, controlled arc that terminated precisely at the base of Tank's skull. The strike wasn't delivered with the wild fury of a barroom brawl or the desperation of a cornered victim. It was clinical, professional, calculated to produce specific results with minimum effort and maximum efficiency. Frank had learned long ago that violence was a tool like any other, dangerous when misused, but precise and effective when applied by someone who understood its proper application. Tank's eyes rolled back in his head, and he dropped to the oil-stained concrete floor like a marionette, whose strings had been suddenly severed. The impact of his body hitting the ground shook. Dust from the ceiling beams and rattled tools on their hooks. But Tank himself was beyond noticing such details. He would remain unconscious for the next 47 minutes. And when he finally awakened, he would discover that his perspective on elderly Otto, mechanic's head, undergone significant revision. Snake reacted first, his criminal instincts and prison honed, reflexes triggering the moment. Tank hit the ground. He swung the ball-peen hammer in a wild arc toward Frank's head, putting all of his wiry strength behind. A blow that would have caved in the skull of an ordinary 70-year-old man. But Frank Novak had never been ordinary, and the years hadn't dulled his ability to read incoming attacks. He ducked not far, just enough, and the hammer whistled past, his ear to embed itself in the wooden workbench behind him, with a solid thunk that spoke to the force behind the swing. Before Snake could recover his balance or attempt a second strike, Frank's elbow found his solar plexus with the kind of precision that spoke to anatomical knowledge, gained through extensive practice. The impact drove all the air from Snake's lungs in a single explosive wheeze, and he joined Tank on the floor, gasping for oxygen that seemed to have suddenly become unavailable. Sparky lunged forward, his hands reaching for something in his jacket, a knife, a gun, or maybe just his cell phone to call for backup. He never found out which, because Frank's knee intercepted his sternum with the mathematical precision of an artillery strike. The sound Sparky made was somewhere between a wheeze and a whimper, and he crumpled like wet cardboard, his aggressive posture dissolving into the fetal curl of someone who'd just learned the difference between looking dangerous and actually being dangerous. Carl Brennan, who'd been examining Frank's customer files with predatory interest just moments before, found himself staring at 3 unconscious colleagues and 1 septuagenarian who appeared to be breathing normally despite having just disabled half a motorcycle gang in less time than it took to tie a shoelace. The remaining 2 iron wolves, who'd been positioned near the exits to prevent Frank's escape, suddenly found themselves reconsidering their career choices and the wisdom of their current employment. They looked at Frank, then at their unconscious brothers, then back at Frank, their expressions cycling rapidly through disbelief, fear, and dawning comprehension. Frank straightened slowly, the wrench still in his hand, and looked at the 3 remaining bikers with the same mild expression he'd worn throughout the entire encounter. His breathing was steady, his posture relaxed, and his voice, when he spoke, carried no more emotion than if he'd been discussing carburetor adjustments. "Anyone else want to discuss protection?" he asked politely. 2 of them ran, simply turned and bolted for the door like their leather pants were on fire, their boots slipping on the oil-stained concrete. In their haste to reach the parking lot, they mounted their motorcycles with fumbling desperation and roared away down Main Street, their exhaust pipes broadcasting their retreat to anyone within a quarter-mile radius. Carl Brennan, either braver or stupider than his fleeing companions, grabbed a tire iron from Frank's tool rack and charged with a kind of wild desperation that spoke to panic rather than tactical thinking. His face was red with fury and embarrassment, his movements telegraphed by emotion and adrenaline rather than controlled by training and experience. Frank sighed, actually sighed, as if Carl's attack was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in an otherwise productive afternoon. The tire iron never made contact with anything, except the steel support beam that held up the shop ceiling. Frank stepped aside, not quickly, but exactly far enough and used Carl's momentum to guide him, face first into the structural support with a kind of precision that suggested extensive practice in redirecting kinetic energy. Carl hit the beam with a sound like a gavel striking wood, and then slid to the floor to join his unconscious friends in what was rapidly becoming the world's most exclusive nap club. A thin trickle of blood ran from his nose, but his breathing remained steady and strong. Frank had been careful about that. He wasn't 25 anymore. And besides, he'd never been particularly fond of paperwork or formal inquiries. Frank looked around his shop, taking careful inventory of the damage and assessing the tactical situation with the methodical thoroughness that had kept him alive through 2 decades of operations that officially never happened. One broken radio, which could be replaced for less than $50. One hammer embedded in his workbench, which would actually improve the workspace by providing a convenient tool storage location. 4 unconscious bikers who would wake up with headaches and a new perspective on elderly auto mechanics. All in all, it could have been considerably worse. He was reaching for his phone to call the police when he heard the distant wail of sirens growing closer. Someone, probably Mrs. Edna Henderson from the neighboring flower shop, who had appointed herself the town's unofficial security force and neighborhood watch coordinator, had already called in the disturbance. Sheriff Bobby Martinez arrived first, his patrol car sliding to a stop in the gravel parking lot with the practiced ease of someone who'd been responding to emergencies for more than a decade. Behind him came 2 deputies in a second patrol car, followed by an ambulance that wouldn't be needed for anything more serious than bruised egos and concussions, though the paramedics didn't know that yet. Bobby had been sheriff of Millfield County for 12 years, and in that time, he'd seen bar fights that left half the participants hospitalized, domestic disputes that required SWAT intervention, a bank robbery that lasted all of 3 minutes before the robber gave up and asked for a lawyer, and even a high-speed chase that ended when the suspect ran out of gas in a cornfield. But he'd never seen anything quite like the scene that greeted him in Frank Novak's auto repair shop. Frank? Bobby stepped carefully around the unconscious bikers, his hand resting on his service weapon, more out of habit than expectation. His voice carried the kind of cautious confusion that police officers develop when confronted with situations that don't fit into standard categories. You okay? Fine, Bobby. Little interruption in my work schedule, but nothing serious. Frank gestured toward the unconscious iron wolves with the casual indifference of someone discussing weather patterns or grocery prices. Bobby looked around the shop, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent his career putting together puzzles from scattered pieces. 4 unconscious bikers arranged on the floor like discarded mannequins. 1 embedded hammer, 1 destroyed radio, and 1 70-year-old auto mechanic who appeared to be completely unruffled by the afternoon's excitement. Want to tell me what happened here? Bobby asked, pulling out his notebook with the automatic reflex of a professional investigator. These boys came by to discuss business. Things got a little heated. Bobby knelt beside Tank Morrison, checking his pulse and finding it strong and steady. He'd been dealing with Tank and the Iron Wolves for 2 years, always staying just 1 step behind their operation, always arriving at crime scenes after the damage was done and the witnesses had been intimidated into silence. Frank, Tank Morrison outweighs you by about 100 pounds and has a reputation for putting people in the hospital. How exactly did things get heated? Frank shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who just solved a minor mechanical problem. Sometimes people underestimate the elderly. Sometimes. Bobby stood and looked at Frank more carefully. Really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in the 12 years they'd known each other. There was something different about the old mechanic today, something that had been there all along, but had somehow remained invisible until this moment. A quality of stillness that spoke to training and experience, a way of moving that suggested capabilities far beyond routine. Automotive maintenance. Frank, I've got to ask, where'd you learn to do this? Bobby gestured toward the unconscious bikers. His expression caught somewhere between admiration and professional concern. Frank was quiet for a moment, his eyes drifting to the photograph on his workbench with an expression that might have been nostalgia, or might have been something else entirely. The picture that none of the bikers had noticed, but that Bobby could see clearly from where he stood 8 men in desert fatigues, younger and harder than they had any right to be, standing beside vehicles that looked like they'd been through a war zone. Long time ago, Frank said finally, his voice carrying the weight of memories that were older than Bobby's career in law enforcement. Different life. Bobby stepped closer to the photograph, his investigator's instincts drawing him toward details that might explain the afternoon's events. As he examined the image more carefully, he began to make out details that told a story more complex than anything he'd expected to find in a small-town auto repair shop. The vehicles in the background weren't standard military issue. They were modified far beyond normal specifications, equipped with communication arrays and weapon mounts that spoke to specialized missions and unconventional warfare. The men themselves stood with the kind of alert professionalism that suggested elite training and extensive combat experience. And there, at the bottom of the photograph in faded ink, was an inscription that made Bobby's breath catch in his throat. Delta Force Operation Desert Storm, Teen Charlie, 1991. In the center of the group, unmistakable despite 30 years of civilian life and peaceful routine, stood Frank Novak. Jesus, Frank, you were Delta Force? Was a lot of things. Now I fix cars. Frank's response was matter-of-fact, delivered with the same tone he might use to discuss transmission, fluid or brake pad replacement. Bobby stared at the photograph, then at the unconscious bikers, then back at Frank, his mind struggling to reconcile the mild-mannered mechanic he'd known for over a decade with the elite soldier, whose exploits were the stuff of classified legend. How many tours? Enough? Iraq? Afghanistan? Among other places. Frank picked up his wrench and examined it, for damage with the careful attention of someone who valued proper tools and maintained equipment. Places that don't show up on maps. Operations that don't appear in history books. And you never mentioned this because... Frank shrugged again, the gesture carrying 30 years of distance from a life he'd deliberately left behind. Past is past. People need their cars fixed, not war stories. Besides, most of what I did is still classified. Will be for another 20 years, assuming anyone remembers to declassify it then. By the time the bikers were loaded into the ambulance and the police cars, news of the incident had spread through Millfield with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. Word traveled from Mrs. Henderson's flower shop to the post, office to the diner to the hardware store, growing more elaborate with each telling. By evening, Frank would have single-handedly defeated a dozen bikers armed with automatic weapons while blindfolded and standing on one leg. Mrs. Henderson pushed through the growing crowd, her gray hair still in curlers and her housecoat flapping around her knees like a protective talisman. Frank, are you all right? She rushed to him with the kind of maternal concern that had made her the unofficial neighborhood protector for 30 years. I saw those awful men come in, and I called Bobby right away. I knew they were up to no good. I'm fine, Edna. Thank you for calling. What did they want? Were they trying to rob you? Frank glanced at Bobby, who was still taking notes and trying to look official despite the small smile that kept tugging at the corners of his mouth. They wanted to sell me insurance. Insurance? Edna looked puzzled, her expression cycling through confusion, comprehension, and finally outrage as she understood the implications. What kind of insurance? The expensive kind. Tom Martinez from the hardware store shouldered his way through the crowd, followed by several other local business owners. All of them looked worried, and Frank knew exactly why. If the Iron Wolves had targeted his shop, they'd probably targeted others as well. In a town the size of Millfield, successful businesses were easy to identify and easier to intimidate. Frank, Tom said, his voice carrying the kind of tension that comes from sleepless nights and mounting bills. Those bikers came by my place yesterday. Wanted $500 a month for protection. Said accidents could happen if I didn't pay. Same here, added Sarah Chun from the flower shop, her normally cheerful demeanor shadowed by worry. Last week, I told them I'd think about it. And now? Frank asked. Now I'm thinking they might want to reconsider their business model. Other voices joined the conversation, each telling a similar story. The Iron Wolves had been systematically working their way through Millfield's business district, targeting every establishment that generated significant revenue. The amounts demanded varied $500 for the larger businesses, $200 or $300 for the smaller ones. But the message was always the same: pay or suffer the consequences. How long has this been going on? Bobby asked, his pen poised over a fresh page in his notebook. About 6 weeks, Tom replied. Started with the bigger places, the bank, a car dealership, the grain elevator. Then they moved on to the rest of us. And nobody reported it? The business owners exchanged uncomfortable glances, the kind of looks that pass between people who share knowledge they'd rather not possess. Finally, Sarah spoke up. We talked about it. But Tank Morrison has a reputation. People who cross him tend to have accidents, equipment failures, building fires, the kind of problems that insurance doesn't cover. Plus, Tom added, we all heard what happened to Mike Stevens down in Oakville when he refused to pay. Someone broke into his store at night, destroyed half his inventory, and left a message written on the wall in paint that washed off before the police. Could photograph it? Bobby made more notes, his expression growing darker with each revelation. Why didn't anyone call me? Because, Edna Henderson said with the blunt honesty of someone who'd lived through 8 decades of human folly. What were you going to do? Arrest them for making vague threats? Guard every business in town 24 hours a day? Face facts, Bobby, until today, they had us all scared, and they knew it. At 5:15 p.m., just as Bobby was finishing his initial incident report and the crowd was beginning to disperse, a black sedan with government plates pulled into the shop's parking lot. 2 people emerged, a man and woman in dark suits, their movements carrying the kind of purposeful efficiency that marked them as federal agents even before they displayed their credentials. The older of the 2 was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. His name was Agent David Cameron, and he'd been with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force for 15 years. His partner, Agent Maria Santos, was younger but no less experienced, having transferred to the Bureau from Army Military Intelligence after completing 2 tours in Afghanistan. Sheriff Martinez? Agent Cameron approached Bobby with the courteous authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of local investigations. I'm Agent Cameron, FBI. This is Agent Santos. We'd like to speak with you about today's incident. Bobby looked from the agents to Frank, then back to the agents. That was fast. How did you? We've been monitoring Iron Wolves' activities for several months. Agent Santos explained. When Tank, Morrison, and 3 associates were hospitalized after what appears to have been a failed extortion attempt, we took notice. Monitoring them for what? RICO violations, racketeering, interstate transportation of stolen goods, money laundering. The Iron Wolves are part of a larger criminal organization that operates across multiple states. Agent Cameron pulled out a tablet and displayed a complex organizational chart that looked like a military command structure. What happened here today wasn't just a local crime, it was an attack on federal investigative priorities. Frank, who had been quietly cleaning his tools while the agent spoke, looked up with interest. How large an organization? Agent Santos studied him carefully, her expression suggesting that she'd already reviewed his background and knew exactly who she was talking to. Large enough to have corrupted local officials in 4 counties, infiltrated 2 police departments, and generated approximately $12 million in revenue over the past 18 months. And Tank Morrison is a mid-level operative who reports to regional commanders, who report to people we're still trying to identify. Until today, he'd been very successful at avoiding law enforcement attention. Agent Cameron looked around the shop, taking in the evidence of Frank's successful defense. That changed when he decided to target the wrong auto mechanic. Mr. Novak, Agent Santos said, stepping forward with a kind of respectful directness that suggested she understood exactly who she was addressing. We'd very much like to discuss your background, specifically your experience with unconventional warfare and special operations. Frank set down his tools and looked at the agents with the kind of assessment he'd once reserved for mission briefings and tactical planning sessions. What kind of discussion? The kind that might help us shut down a criminal organization that's been terrorizing honest people for far too long. Agent Cameron replied. The kind that might require certain specialized skills and experience that most law enforcement agencies don't possess. Bobby looked from Frank to the agents, his expression cycling through confusion, comprehension, and finally concern. Wait a minute. Are you asking Frank to? We're asking Mr. Novak to consider consulting on a federal investigation, Agent Santos said diplomatically. His unique background and recent experience with the Iron Wolves could be invaluable in developing tactical approaches to a complex problem. Frank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting once again to the photograph on his workbench. 8 young men in desert fatigues, ready to face whatever dangers their country required them to confront. Most of them were dead now, killed in operations that would never be acknowledged or commemorated. A few had returned home to find that civilian life didn't fit as well as they'd hoped. I walked away from that life 23 years ago, Frank said finally. We understand, Agent Cameron replied, but sometimes that life doesn't walk away from you. Frank looked around his shop, taking in the familiar chaos of tools and parts and projects that had defined his life for more than 2 decades. This place had been his sanctuary, his refuge from a world that moved too fast and demanded too much. Here, problems had clear solutions and predictable outcomes. Engines either ran or they didn't. Transmissions either shifted smoothly or they didn't. Everything was mechanical, logical, repairable. But outside his shop, the world had grown more complex and dangerous. Organizations like the Iron Wolves preyed on decent people who'd worked hard for what little they had, who couldn't afford to fight back and couldn't expect protection from law enforcement that was spread too thin, across too much territory. If I agree to help, Frank said slowly, it's temporary. Consultation only. I don't carry weapons anymore, and I don't engage in direct action. Understood, Agent Cameron replied. And I continue operating my shop. My customers depend on me, and I don't break commitments to good people. Of course. And when this is over, when the Iron Wolves and their superiors are in federal prison, I go back to being just another small-town mechanic. No publicity, no recognition, no congressional hearings or book deals. Agent Santos smiled. Mr. Novak, if we do this right, no one will ever know you were involved. The best operations are the ones that never officially happen. Frank nodded slowly, understanding the implications and accepting them. When do we start? Tomorrow morning. Our field office in Indianapolis. We'll send a car. I'll drive myself, Frank said. I don't like depending on other people for transportation. After the agents left and Bobby finished his paperwork and the crowd finally dispersed, Frank sat alone in his shop as the evening light faded to darkness. The familiar sounds of a small town settling into night filtered through the walls, cars passing on Main Street, voices from the diner across the road, the distant whistle of a freight train carrying grain from farms to markets. Everything was exactly as it had been that morning, but nothing would ever be the same again. The events of the day had stirred memories he'd kept carefully buried, brought back skills he'd hoped never to use again. But they'd also reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten, the satisfaction that came from standing between predators and their prey. The Iron Wolves were finished in Millfield, but Frank's work wasn't done. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to serve something greater than himself. At 70 years old, he was still Frank Novak, auto mechanic and guardian, keeper of peace and protector of those who couldn't protect themselves. Frank picked up the photograph from his workbench and studied the faces of his old teammates, young men who'd believed in something bigger than themselves, who'd sacrificed pieces of their souls to keep the world a little safer for people they'd never meet. Still here, he said quietly to the faces in the picture. Still standing watch. Outside, Millfield settled into the peaceful quiet of another evening in a small town where good people could sleep safely, protected by those who understood that some responsibilities transcend time, age, and the simple desire for peace. Frank Novak, mechanic and guardian, turned off the lights and locked the door, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Some chapters never really end. They just wait for the next page to be written. The FBI field office in Indianapolis was a study in bureaucratic efficiency and controlled chaos. Agent Santos led Frank through security checkpoints and down corridors lined with photographs of most wanted, fugitives and organizational charts that looked like military command structures. The building hummed with the kind of purposeful energy that Frank remembered from his own operational days, when every hour counted and every decision carried consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate moment. Mr. Novak, Agent Cameron said as they entered a secure conference room, lined with monitors and maps. I want you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. The main screen displayed a network analysis that looked like a spider web spanning multiple states. Names, photographs, and connection lines showed relationships between criminal organizations, corrupt officials, and legitimate businesses that had been infiltrated or intimidated into cooperation. The Iron Wolves are just one tentacle of something much larger. Agent Santos explained, using a laser pointer to highlight different sections of the network. We call it the Midwest Coalition, a loose federation of motorcycle clubs, prison gangs, and organized crime families that have learned to cooperate instead of compete. Frank studied the display with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years analyzing enemy command structures and identifying critical vulnerabilities. Central Command? 3 primary leaders based in Chicago, Detroit, and Kansas City. They coordinate activities across state lines, share resources, and most importantly, provide protection for local operations like Tank Morrison's crew. Which means, Frank said, understanding the implications immediately, that what happened yesterday in Millfield has already been reported up the chain of command. Exactly. Our intelligence indicates that the coalition leadership is conducting damage, assessment, and planning response operations. They can't allow successful resistance to stand. It might encourage others to fight back. Agent Cameron pulled up another display, showing financial flows and money laundering operations. The Midwest Coalition generates approximately $50 million annually through extortion, drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and human trafficking. They've corrupted officials in 14 counties, compromised law enforcement in 6 jurisdictions, and maintained operational security that's frustrated federal investigators for 3 years. Until now, Agent Santos added, your encounter with the Iron Wolves has given us our first significant break in the case. Tank Morrison is talking not by choice, but his cell phone and computer contained intelligence that's helping you map the entire organization. Frank absorbed this information with the systematic thoroughness that had made him effective in his previous career. What do you need from me? Strategic assessment. The coalition operates like a military organization cell structure. Operational security, command hierarchy. Traditional law enforcement approaches haven't been effective because they're designed to deal with conventional criminals, not organized paramilitary groups. You need someone who understands unconventional warfare. We need someone who's conducted it, Agent Cameron replied. Someone who can think like they think, anticipate their responses, identify their weaknesses. Frank was quiet for a moment, studying the network display and seeing patterns that reminded him of enemy organizations he'd faced in places that didn't appear on any map. How much time do we have? Our sources indicate that coalition leadership is planning a response operation within the next 72 hours. They need to make a statement, re-establish their authority, demonstrate that resistance has consequences. What kind of statement? Agent Santos exchanged glances with her partner before answering. The kind that involves burning buildings, killing witnesses, and sending a message that will discourage anyone else from following your example. Frank understood. He'd seen similar tactics in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other theaters where conventional rules didn't apply, and psychological warfare was as important as physical violence. They'll target Millfield. Almost certainly. The question is how, when, and with what resources. And you want me to help you stop them. We want you to help us destroy them, Agent Cameron corrected. Completely, permanently, in a way that ensures they never threaten innocent people again. Over the next 6 hours, Frank found himself drawn back into a world he thought he'd left behind forever. The conference room filled with maps, photographs, intelligence reports, and tactical assessments as federal agents and analysts briefed him on 3 years' worth of investigation into the Midwest Coalition. The organization was more sophisticated than he'd initially realized. They maintained legitimate business fronts, employed lawyers and accountants, and had developed relationships with corrupt officials that provided early warning of law enforcement activities. Their operational security was excellent encrypted communications, compartmentalized intelligence, and strict protocols that limited individual members' knowledge of the larger organization. They've learned from the mistakes of previous criminal organizations, Agent Santos explained. No flashy displays of wealth, no unnecessary violence that attracts media attention, no territorial disputes that bring unwanted scrutiny. They operate like a business efficient, profitable, and carefully managed. Which makes them predictable, Frank observed. Business organizations follow patterns, make decisions based on cost-benefit analysis, respond to threats in logical ways. Exactly. And right now, you represent a threat to their business model. A 70-year-old auto mechanic who successfully resisted their most effective intimidation tactics has created a problem that requires solution. Frank studied surveillance photographs of coalition leadership, 3 men who looked more like corporate executives than traditional criminals. They were smart, educated, and disciplined in ways that made them far more dangerous than common thugs or drug dealers. They'll send a team to Millfield, Frank said with the certainty of someone who'd studied similar organizations under operational conditions. Not local talent like the Iron Wolves professionals from outside the region. Military or police backgrounds, sophisticated equipment, multiple contingency plans. Our intelligence suggests a minimum of 8 operatives, possibly 12. Mixed backgrounds, former military, ex-police, private security contractors who've crossed over to criminal enterprises. Timeline? Tomorrow night at the earliest, possibly Wednesday. They need time to conduct reconnaissance, identify targets, plan escape routes. Frank nodded, his mind already working through tactical considerations that he hadn't contemplated in 23 years. What resources do I have? Agent Cameron smiled grimly. Officially, you're a consultant providing strategic advice to a federal investigation. Unofficially, whatever you need to protect innocent people and neutralize a criminal threat. I'll need to return to Millfield tonight. If they're planning reconnaissance, I want to be there when they arrive. Will provide backup? No. Frank's interruption was quiet but firm. Federal agents conducting surveillance in a town the size of Millfield would be noticed immediately. This needs to look like normal life continuing as usual. Then how do we coordinate? Frank pulled out his cell phone, a basic model that he'd owned for years and used mainly for customer calls. I'll call when I need you. Until then, stay away from Millfield and let me handle things my way. Agent Santos looked concerned. Mr. Novak, you're talking about facing a professional hit team by yourself. These aren't small-town bikers looking for protection. Money, these are trained killers with military-grade equipment. I know exactly what they are, Frank replied quietly. The question is whether they know what I am. Frank drove back to Millfield through the gathering darkness of a Tuesday evening, his mind shifting from the analytical detachment of strategic planning to the focused awareness of operational preparation. The familiar landscape of cornfields and small farms took on new significance. As he evaluated sightlines, approach routes, and defensive positions, his shop sat at the edge of town, isolated enough to provide privacy, but visible enough that any disturbance would be noticed by neighbors. The building itself was solid brick construction, limited access points, good fields of fire in all directions. If someone wanted to make a statement in Millfield, his shop would be the logical target. Frank parked behind the building and entered through the rear door, moving through the familiar space with new eyes. The Iron Wolves had been amateurs, relying on intimidation and superior numbers to achieve their objectives. The team that was coming would be professionals who understood violence as a tool and applied it with surgical precision. He walked to his workbench and picked up the photograph that had revealed his identity to Sheriff Martinez. 8 young men in desert fatigues, ready to face whatever dangers their country required them to confront. Most of them were dead now, but their training and experience lived on in the one survivor, who'd managed to build a peaceful life far from the battlefields, where they'd served together. Frank opened a tool cabinet that hadn't been touched in 23 years and removed a small lockbox from behind a false panel. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were items that most people would never recognize and that he'd hoped never to touch again. A fighting knife with a 7-inch blade, night vision goggles that were obsolete by current standards but still functional, communication equipment that operated on frequencies not used by civilian agencies. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped separately, was something that represented the culmination of 30 years of military service, the Medal of Honor that had been awarded for actions in a place that officially didn't exist, during an operation that had never been acknowledged by any government agency. Frank had never displayed the medal, never mentioned it to anyone, never used it to gain recognition or advantage. Like most of his service record, it was classified at levels that existed above top secret, filed in archives that most people didn't know existed. But tonight, as he prepared to face an enemy that threatened innocent people, he allowed himself to remember what it meant to serve something greater than yourself. They came on Wednesday night, just as Frank had predicted. 3 vehicles with out-of-state plates, moving through Millfield with the careful precision of professionals. Conducting reconnaissance. Frank watched from his shop window as they made 2 passes through the downtown area, their occupants using high-end surveillance equipment to map the terrain and identify potential complications. The team leader was a man named Victor Reeves, a former Army Ranger who'd left military service under circumstances that weren't discussed in polite company. He specialized in operations that required precision, discretion, and the kind of violence that sent unmistakable messages to anyone considering resistance to coalition authority. His team consisted of 7 other operatives, each selected for specific skills and experience. 2 were former police officers who'd been dismissed for excessive force. 3 were military veterans who'd found civilian life insufficiently challenging. 1 was a demolitions expert who'd learned his trade in legitimate government service before discovering that private contractors paid considerably better for similar skills. Frank tracked their movements from concealed positions, using skills that had been dormant for decades, but remained sharp through the kind of training that never really fades. They were good professional, disciplined, thorough in their preparation, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory, following patterns that had worked in urban environments but weren't necessarily applicable to small-town situations. More importantly, they were expecting to find an elderly auto mechanic who'd gotten lucky against a group of local thugs, not a Delta Force veteran who'd spent 20 years conducting operations against targets that were considerably more dangerous than corrupt motorcycle gangs. At 11:47 p.m., Frank's phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and carried the kind of authority that came from absolute confidence in superior firepower and tactical advantage. "Mr. Novak, my name is Victor Reeves. I believe we need to have a conversation." "About what?" "About the unfortunate incident involving Tank Morrison and his associates. About the disruption of legitimate business operations. About the need for certain situations to be corrected." Frank listened without responding, allowing Reeves to reveal information about his planning and intentions. "You've caused some very important people considerable inconvenience, Mr. Novak. The kind of inconvenience that requires response, demonstration, correction. Nothing personal, just business." "What kind of business?" "The kind that ensures other people understand the consequences of interfering with established operations. The kind that prevents future incidents. The kind that maintains order and respect for proper authority." "And if I'm not interested in your business proposition?" Reeves chuckled, the sound carrying the confidence of someone who'd never encountered serious opposition. "Mr. Novak, you don't seem to understand your situation. You're a 70-year-old man living alone in a small town where the nearest law enforcement is 20 minutes away on a good day. I have 8 trained professionals, equipped with military-grade weapons and authorization to use whatever force proves necessary to complete our mission." "What mission is that?" "To make sure that what happened to Tank Morrison never happens again. To demonstrate that resistance has consequences. To send a message that will be remembered long after tonight is over." Frank was quiet for a moment, processing tactical information and calculating response options. "And after you send your message?" "After tonight, Mr. Novak, you'll no longer be a problem for anyone." The line went dead, leaving Frank alone in his shop with the certainty that professional killers were preparing to demonstrate the cost of defying criminal authority. But Victor Reeves had made one critical error in his threat assessment. He'd assumed that Frank Novak was nothing more than what he appeared to be. They came at 2:17 a.m., moving through the darkness with night vision equipment and suppressed weapons. Their approach coordinated through military style, communications, and covering movements. Frank watched them deploy around his shop with the professional appreciation of someone who recognized excellent tactical execution. But Frank had spent the previous 6 hours preparing for exactly this scenario, drawing on training and experience that had kept him alive in places where American soldiers weren't supposed to be conducting operations against enemies who officially didn't exist. The shop's electrical system had been modified to allow him to control lighting from multiple locations. The building's interior had been rearranged to provide concealment and cover while channeling attackers into kill zones where superior numbers wouldn't provide tactical advantage. And Frank himself had prepared for violence in ways that he'd hoped never to experience again. Victor Reeves had made his second mistake when he'd assumed that an elderly auto mechanic would be intimidated by professional operators with military equipment. His third mistake was deploying his team using standard urban assault tactics in a situation that required different approaches. His final mistake was entering Frank Novak's shop without understanding that some men never really retire from war. They just wait for war to find them again. What happened next lasted 17 minutes and would be studied by military analysts for years to come, though the official reports would never acknowledge Frank's identity or the true nature of the threat he'd faced. The first 2 operatives entered through the front door, moving with textbook precision and professional competence. They found themselves in a shop that had been transformed into something resembling an urban warfare training facility, with concealed firing positions and carefully prepared ambush sites. Frank had positioned himself in a location that allowed him to observe the entire interior, while remaining invisible to anyone entering through normal access points. When the lead operative stepped into the kill zone, Frank had prepared 30 years of training and experience condensed into a single moment of perfectly executed violence. The suppressed pistol Frank carried made almost no sound as it ended the first operative's threat to innocent people. The second attacker had perhaps 2 seconds to process what had happened before he joined his partner in discovering that retirement didn't necessarily mean the end of operational effectiveness. Victor Reeves, monitoring the assault from his command position outside the building, realized that his tactical assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. When his point team failed to report successful entry, his subsequent decision sending additional operatives into what was clearly a prepared defensive position demonstrated the kind of rigid thinking that had made him effective against conventional targets, but vulnerable to unconventional opponents. Frank had spent 20 years learning how to fight enemies who outnumbered him, outgunned him, and operated on their home territory. 8 professional killers with superior equipment represented a significant threat, but not an unprecedented one for someone who'd survived operations against entire enemy units in environments where capture meant torture and death meant the complete failure of critical missions. By dawn, Millfield was safe again. The Midwest Coalition's demonstration of power had become a demonstration of something else entirely: the truth that some men never lose their capacity to protect innocent people, regardless of age or circumstances. Victor Reeves and his team had underestimated their target in ways that proved fatal to their mission and, in most cases, to themselves. The surviving operatives would spend the remainder of their lives in federal prison, providing information that would dismantle the Coalition's network and protect countless communities from criminal intimidation. Sheriff Bobby Martinez arrived at 6:30 a.m. to find Frank drinking coffee and reading customer work orders as if nothing unusual had happened. The shop showed no signs of the previous night's violence. Frank had spent considerable time ensuring that the evidence was properly arranged for federal investigators, who would arrive later that morning with explanations that satisfied official requirements while revealing nothing about operational realities. Frank? Bobby's voice carried the kind of cautious concern that police officers develop when confronting situations that don't fit normal categories. We got reports of gunfire last night. Neighbors said it sounded like a war zone. Backfire from Mrs. Patterson's truck. Frank replied without looking up from his paperwork. Been telling her for months that she needs a new muffler. Bobby looked around the shop, noting details that suggested recent activity of a more serious nature than automotive repair. Frank, there are federal agents setting up a command post at the high school. They say there was some kind of terrorist incident that's been resolved. Is that so? They also say that certain individuals provided crucial assistance in protecting the community from a significant threat. Frank finally looked up from his work orders, his expression carrying the kind of patient tolerance that teachers reserve for students who haven't quite grasped the lesson. Bobby, if federal agents want to set up command posts and write reports about terrorist incidents, that's their business. My business is fixing cars for people who need reliable transportation. Bobby nodded slowly, understanding that some conversations were best left unfinished. Frank, thanks. For whatever you did or didn't do last night, thanks. Frank returned to his paperwork with the satisfied expression of someone who'd completed a necessary task and could return to more pleasant pursuits. Just doing my job, Bobby. Just doing my job. In the days that followed, life in Millfield returned to its normal rhythm of small-town concerns and everyday challenges. Frank reopened his shop for regular business, working on transmissions and brake systems and the 1,000 mundane problems that kept the community mobile. The federal investigation concluded with the arrest of 47 individuals across multiple states, the seizure of assets worth approximately $30 million, and the complete dismantling of a criminal organization that had terrorized honest people for too many years. The Midwest Coalition ceased to exist as an operational entity, its leadership either imprisoned or dead, its network of corruption exposed and destroyed. Frank's role in these events was never officially acknowledged. Federal reports credited local law enforcement cooperation and community vigilance for the successful resolution of a complex criminal investigation. No medals were awarded, no congressional hearings were conducted. Number books were written about the elderly auto mechanic who'd reminded an entire criminal organization that some Americans still understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Most people in Millfield never learned the complete truth about what had happened in Frank's shop on those 2 nights when professional criminals had discovered that their assumptions about small-town vulnerability were dangerously wrong. They knew that the Iron Wolves had been defeated, that federal agents had conducted some kind of operation, and that their community was safe again. That was enough. Frank Novak returned to his routine of honest work and quiet service, fixing the mechanical problems that kept his neighbors mobile and his community functioning. He never spoke about his military service, never sought recognition for his actions, never asked for anything more than the opportunity to live peacefully among people who appreciated craftsmanship and reliability. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done and the shop was still, he would look at the photograph on his workbench and remember what it meant to serve something greater than yourself. 8 young men in desert fatigues who believed in protecting innocent people from those who would prey upon them. 7 of them were gone now, their service completed in places that would never be acknowledged or commemorated. But their commitment lived on in the one survivor who discovered that retirement from military service didn't mean retirement from the obligation to stand between predators and their prey. Frank Novak, auto mechanic and guardian, keeper of peace and protector of those who couldn't protect themselves, had proven that some responsibilities transcend age, circumstance, and a simple desire for a quiet life. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear coveralls, carry wrenches instead of weapons, and measure their success not in medals won, but in communities protected and families kept safe. Sometimes the most dangerous warriors are the ones who've learned to hide their strength behind the mask of ordinary life, waiting patiently for the moment when extraordinary courage is required to protect the innocent from those who mistake kindness for weakness. Frank Novak had spent 23 years proving that the best warriors are those who hope never to fight again, but who stand ready when fighting becomes necessary to protect what matters most. In Millfield, Indiana, where honest people work hard and sleep safely, that was enough. That was everything.